Silence has a sound when it lingers long enough. It is not the peaceful kind that follows a prayer answered or a storm that has passed. It is heavier than that, dense, unyielding, almost confrontational. It settles into the room, into the chest, into the spaces between thoughts. And for a long time, the protagonist had learned to live with it, convincing himself that silence simply meant waiting. He sat alone, as he often did now, in the early hours before the day demanded explanations. The light from the window was pale and undecided, unsure whether it belonged to night or morning. He liked this hour because nothing asked anything of him. No voices, no expectations, no need to pretend that clarity had arrived. His Bible lay open on the table, untouched for days, open not to be read but to remind him that answers were supposed to live somewhere nearby. The pages had become familiar in a distant way, like a city you once loved but no longer visited. He knew the verses. He could quote them if necessary, but knowing had not translated into peace. He had prayed. That much could not be denied. He had prayed in moments of desperation and in moments of discipline. He had prayed with words and without them. He had prayed kneeling, standing, whispering, and crying. He had prayed until his voice grew tired and until silence was the only response he could offer. And yet, here he was, not broken beyond repair, not crushed completely, just suspended. As if life had paused mid-sentence and refused to continue until something unspoken was acknowledged. It was not that God had disappeared. That thought felt too dramatic, too final. Instead, it felt like God had gone quiet. Or worse, like God was watching, waiting, unmoved by the urgency that filled the protagonist's prayers. He leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes. How long? He had asked before. How long would this season last? How long would the confusion remain? How long before direction replaced doubt? But lately, another question had begun to surface, uninvited and unsettling. It did not come from desperation. It came from stillness. What if God has already answered? The thought disturbed him more than silence ever had, because unanswered prayers preserved hope. Ignored answers demanded responsibility. He dismissed the thought at first, as one dismisses a passing shadow. Surely, if God had answered, it would have been clear, loud, undeniable. God was not subtle when things truly mattered. At least that was what he believed. And yet, doubt lingered. The silence did not feel empty. It felt intentional. Days passed, blending into one another. The protagonist moved through life competently enough. He fulfilled obligations. He smiled when required. He offered the appropriate words when asked how he was doing. "I'm fine" had become less of a lie and more of a placeholder. Something said to avoid conversations he no longer had the energy to explain. At night, however, the silence returned with precision. It waited for him. In those moments, memories resurfaced, moments he had ignored, conversations that had unsettled him, verses that had stirred discomfort rather than comfort. He remembered how often he had prayed for change, only to feel challenged instead. He had asked God to fix things. God had remained quiet, or perhaps God had spoken, but not in the way he wanted. The idea returned again, more persistent this time. What if the problem was not heaven's silence, but his own resistance? He opened his eyes and stared at the ceiling. He thought of how easily he listened when God's words aligned with his desires. Promises were easy to embrace. Blessings required no effort. Comfort demanded no change. Correction, however, was another matter. He thought back to the last time he felt genuine conviction, not guilt, but conviction. That gentle but firm inner nudge that something needed to change. He remembered dismissing it, not rejecting it outright, but postponing it. Later, he had told himself, when things calm down, when circumstances improve, when it makes more sense. Later had never come. Instead, the same issues resurfaced. The same emotional weight returned. The same frustrations repeated themselves with unsettling consistency. It was as if life itself was looping, replaying the same lesson until he was willing to learn it. But learning would cost him something. It would cost comfort, control, pride. So he waited instead. He waited for God to move first. That morning, the quiet felt different. It was not accusatory, but it was persistent, almost patient, the kind of patience that does not rush because it knows it will eventually be acknowledged. He reached for the Bible, more out of routine than expectation, and flipped through the pages without intention. His eyes landed on a familiar passage, one he had read many times before. This time, however, it did not inspire him. It unsettled him. The words felt personal. Uncomfortably so. He closed the book. "Not today," he whispered, unsure whether he was speaking to God or to himself. That was the pattern, he realized. He did not disbelieve. He did not rebel. He simply postponed obedience under the disguise of wisdom. And yet, the silence persisted. As the day unfolded, small moments echoed the same theme. A conversation with a friend that touched a nerve, a message that arrived at the wrong or perhaps right time, a thought that returned uninvited, asking the same question again and again. What is God trying to teach you right now? The protagonist resisted answering it. It was easier to assume that the lesson would come later, in a clearer form. Easier to believe that God would eventually intervene, shift the circumstances, remove the obstacle. Surely that was how growth worked. But deep down, another truth began to surface. Maybe God was not waiting for the situation to change. Maybe God was waiting for him to listen. That realization unsettled him more than anything else had. Because if it was true, then the silence was not abandonment. It was invitation, an invitation he had been declining. As evening approached, the sky darkened slowly, deliberately. The protagonist sat once more in the same place, the quiet returning like an old companion. But now it felt charged, with meaning, with purpose. The silence asked nothing aloud. It simply waited. And for the first time, the protagonist understood that waiting itself was part of the lesson. Not waiting for God, but waiting with God. Listening instead of demanding, reflecting instead of escaping. Still, understanding did not equal obedience. Not yet. The chapter closes with him, standing at the edge of awareness, aware that something was being asked of him, something deeper than prayer requests or emotional relief. A lesson was forming, quietly, patiently. He did not know it yet, but the silence was only the beginning. Soon he would realize that what felt like a pause was actually preparation for a confrontation with his own prayers and with what he truly wanted God to change. The silence did not disappear after that realization. If anything, it followed him more closely, threading itself through his thoughts during the day and settling beside him at night. But now it carried weight. Meaning. It was no longer an absence of sound. It was a presence asking to be acknowledged. Still, acknowledgement did not come easily. Instead of sitting with the question that had begun to rise within him, the protagonist did what he had always done when discomfort grew too sharp. He prayed harder. Not differently, just harder. With more urgency, more words, more intensity. As if volume could replace surrender. His prayers became longer, more detailed, more specific. He listed everything that needed to change, everything that felt wrong, everything that made life feel stalled and heavy. He spoke of closed doors, delayed answers, persistent struggles. He prayed as someone negotiating an escape rather than seeking understanding. God, remove this. God, fix that. God, take me out of this season. There was passion in his voice, sincerity in his plea. He was not pretending. He genuinely wanted relief. But beneath every prayer lay the same unspoken assumption. If the situation changes, I will be fine. He did not yet consider the possibility that the situation was not the problem. Morning after morning, he carved out time to pray, determined to prove to God and to himself that he was doing his part. He believed that persistence would eventually wear down the resistance he perceived in heaven. Scripture encouraged perseverance in prayer, did it not? So he persisted, clinging to that truth while quietly ignoring others. What he did not realize was that his prayers, though faithful in form, were limited in scope. They aimed at escape, not transformation. They asked for release, not refinement. And God listened. Of that, there was no doubt. But God did not respond in the way the protagonist expected. Instead of solutions, there were interruptions. Instead of breakthroughs, there were questions. Moments arose that gently but firmly redirected his attention away from circumstances and back toward his heart. During one prayer, as he poured out his frustrations, a thought surfaced uninvited. Why does this situation affect you so deeply? He paused, unsettled by the question, then quickly pushed it aside and continued praying as planned. Another time, while asking God to remove a difficult relationship from his life, a different question interrupted him. What is this relationship revealing about you? Again, he ignored it. That was not what he had come to discuss. He wanted answers, not introspection. As days passed, a subtle pattern emerged. Every prayer for escape seemed to be met with an invitation to self-examination. Every request for change was answered with an opportunity for growth. The disconnect frustrated him. He began to feel as though God was deliberately avoiding the real issue. "Why won't you just fix this?" he asked one evening, the edge of desperation returning to his voice. "I'm doing everything I know how to do." And in a way, he was right. He was doing everything except listening. The prayers continued, but something in them grew strained, less hopeful, more transactional. He began to measure his spiritual life by outcomes rather than obedience. If progress occurred, God was near. If nothing changed, God must be silent. This way of thinking exhausted him. He started to notice how often his prayers revolved around control over timing, over outcomes, over how God should act and when. Even surrender had conditions attached. "I trust you," he would say, quietly adding, "as long as you move soon." He did not recognize this as resistance. To him, it felt reasonable. After all, wasn't faith supposed to produce results? But beneath the surface, another truth was forming. His prayers were sincere, but they were also selective. He wanted God's power without God's pruning. He wanted deliverance without discipline, blessing without breaking. And God, in his wisdom, refused to cooperate with that version of faith. One afternoon, the protagonist sat in a quiet place, exhausted from praying without relief. His words felt empty now, rehearsed. He stared ahead, unsure what else to say. For the first time in a long while, he stopped speaking before finishing his usual prayer. The silence returned, but this time it did not feel distant. It felt close, almost intimate. A thought rose gently without accusation. "You keep asking me to change what surrounds you, but what if I'm trying to change what is within you?" He felt defensive immediately. "I'm open to change," he whispered, though the words felt thinner than he expected. "I just need things to get better first." There it was again, that condition. He began to see it reluctantly. His prayers were built around the idea that peace would follow improvement, that growth would come after relief, that obedience could wait until circumstances felt safer. But what if God's order was different? This realization disturbed him deeply, because it challenged his understanding of how God worked. He had always believed that hardship was something to endure until deliverance arrived. He had not considered that hardship itself might be the classroom. The thought lingered. He remembered stories from Scripture, stories he had read many times but never truly applied. Moses in the wilderness, Joseph in prison, David in hiding. None of them prayed their way out immediately. Instead, they were shaped where they were. And yet, knowing this did not make acceptance easier. That night his prayer changed, not because he intended it to, but because exhaustion stripped away his rehearsed words. "I don't know what you want from me," he admitted. "I just know I don't want to stay here." The honesty surprised him. For the first time, he was not trying to sound faithful. He was simply being real. And in that moment, something shifted, not around him, but within him. He sensed that God was less concerned with where he was than with who he was becoming there. Still, resistance remained. The idea of learning instead of escaping felt threatening. Learning meant confronting habits he had justified, attitudes he had defended, patterns he had normalized. It meant acknowledging that some of his pain was not imposed, but permitted for growth. That was a hard truth to face. Over the next few days, his prayers grew quieter, shorter, less demanding. He still asked God to intervene, but now there was hesitation in his voice, as if part of him suspected that intervention might come in the form of instruction rather than relief. He began to notice how often God's answers took the shape of repetition. The same themes resurfaced in conversations. The same convictions returned during quiet moments. The same inner nudges refused to fade. It was as if God was circling something important, waiting for him to see it clearly. Yet, he continued to delay. "Soon," he told himself, "I'll deal with it soon." But soon stretched longer than he expected. As the chapter draws to a close, the protagonist finds himself caught between two prayers, one asking God to change the season, and another, still unspoken, asking God to reveal why the season remains. He does not yet realize it, but the repeated nature of his struggle is not random, it is intentional, a divine pattern forming patiently, insistently. And as he continues to pray for escape, life begins to whisper a different message altogether, one that will soon become impossible to ignore. At first, the repetition was subtle enough to dismiss. The protagonist told himself it was coincidence, nothing more than the natural rhythm of life looping familiar challenges. After all, everyone faced recurring problems. Everyone revisited old struggles from time to time. That was normal. That was human. But this felt different. The same frustrations were returning with an accuracy that unsettled him. Different days, different faces, different circumstances. But the core issue remained unchanged. It was as though life had changed its costume, but kept the same script. He noticed it one morning while replaying a conversation in his mind. A friend had spoken words that lingered longer than expected. They were not harsh, not accusatory, but they struck something deep, something he had tried to ignore. "You always seem to get stuck at the same point," the friend had said casually, without realizing the weight of the observation. "Like you're moving, but not really going anywhere." He had laughed it off at the time, made a joke, changed the subject. But later, alone, the words returned. The same point. That phrase echoed uncomfortably. He began to pay closer attention, though reluctantly. Patterns emerged everywhere once he allowed himself to see them. The same emotional triggers, the same defensive reactions, the same internal arguments he used to justify his choices. Even his prayers seemed to circle the same themes, never quite reaching resolution. It was exhausting. What troubled him most was not that the struggles existed, but that they refused to evolve. He expected progression, new challenges, new terrain, new lessons. Instead, he felt like a student repeating the same grade, wondering why promotion never came. He asked God about it once, late at night, frustration finally overriding his restraint. "Why does this keep happening?" he whispered. Why does it feel like I'm walking in circles? The silence answered him, not with absence, but with reflection. In that stillness, memories surfaced, moments when he had felt prompted to act differently, but chose the familiar instead. Opportunities for growth he had postponed, convictions he had softened with excuses. He began to understand something unsettling. Patterns persist when lessons remain unlearned. This realization did not bring comfort, it brought confrontation. He thought about how often he had asked God to remove obstacles without asking why those obstacles remained. How frequently he prayed for new doors while refusing to walk through the ones already open. How easily he interpreted repetition as opposition rather than instruction. The idea that God might be teaching him through repetition felt almost offensive at first. Surely God could find a more creative method. Surely he would not allow the same pain to repeat if it served no purpose. Unless it did. Scripture returned to his mind. Uninvited but persistent, stories of wandering Israelites who walked in circles for 40 years, not because the destination was unclear, but because obedience was incomplete. Stories of lessons delayed not by God's unwillingness to lead, but by humanity's resistance to follow. He had read those stories many times. He had never imagined himself inside one. Over the following weeks, the repetition intensified. Not in severity, but in clarity. It was as though the message grew sharper with each recurrence. Situations aligned too precisely to be ignored. Different people echoed the same concerns. Different sermons touched the same nerve. Different passages of Scripture illuminated the same truth. He felt surrounded, not by enemies, but by reminders. And yet, instead of responding with humility, he felt irritation rising within him. The repetition felt unfair. He had prayed, he had waited, he had remained faithful, at least in his own estimation. Why won't God move on? He asked himself, frustration edging toward resentment. Why does he keep bringing me back here? The answer, though unspoken, hovered close. Because you haven't moved. That thought startled him. He resisted it instinctively, searching for reasons to disprove it. He listed the ways he had grown, the changes he had made, the progress he believed he had achieved. Surely he was not the same person he had been before. And yet, when he looked honestly, he saw it. The same core resistance, dressed differently. The same fear of surrender, the same desire to remain in control. The same desire to remain in control, the same habit of negotiating with God rather than yielding to Him. The pattern was not external, it was internal. This realization marked a turning point, though not an immediate one. Awareness did not translate into action. In fact, awareness made resistance more complex. He now knew what God might be addressing, but knowing made the cost clearer, and therefore harder to accept. Because breaking a pattern required change, real change. Not emotional insight or spiritual language, but altered behavior, new responses, different choices, the kind of change that exposed vulnerability and demanded trust. He was not ready for that, so instead he continued to circle the pattern, hoping clarity alone might dissolve it. But patterns do not dissolve through observation. They dissolve through obedience. One evening, as he reflected on the day, a strange thought surfaced. What if God is not repeating the lesson because he is displeased, but because he is patient? The idea softened something in him. He had always associated repetition with failure, with delay, with punishment, but patience reframed it entirely. A teacher does not repeat a lesson because the student is incapable, but because the lesson matters. And perhaps this lesson mattered more than he realized. He thought of how gently God had pursued him, not forcing, not shouting, not condemning, just returning again and again to the same truth, waiting for recognition, waiting for response. That night his prayer shifted slightly. God, he said slowly, carefully, If you are trying to teach me something, help me see it." The words felt dangerous because seeing would lead to responsibility, and responsibility would lead to choice. Over the next days, the repetition continued, but now it felt less frustrating and more revealing. He began to see how his reactions maintained the pattern, how avoidance prolonged it, how partial obedience reinforced it. The lesson was no longer hidden. It was standing in plain sight. Still, he hesitated. Acknowledging a lesson is one thing, embracing it is another. As this chapter draws to a close, the protagonist stands at a critical threshold. He can no longer claim ignorance. The pattern has exposed itself. The repetition has spoken. The question is no longer, why does this keep happening? The question has become far more personal and far more difficult. What am I refusing to learn? That question lingers, heavy and unresolved, preparing the ground for what comes next. Because now that the pattern has been revealed, resistance will become impossible to disguise, and conviction, once recognized, demands a response. Conviction arrived quietly, but it did not stay gentle for long. At first, it felt like a mild unease, an internal awareness that something needed attention. The protagonist recognized it from past experiences, moments when God's voice nudged rather than commanded. Conviction, he knew, was meant to guide, not to condemn. It was a gift, not a weapon. But this time it lingered. It followed him into conversations, into decisions, into moments he once navigated on autopilot. Where he had once moved freely, he now hesitated. Where he had once felt justified, he now felt questioned. Conviction had shifted from suggestion to spotlight. He found himself increasingly aware of his reactions, how quickly he became defensive, how often he avoided difficult truths, how instinctively he protected his own comfort. None of these traits were new, but now they were illuminated in a way that left little room for denial. This awareness unsettled him. He had always considered himself spiritually attentive. He prayed, he reflected, he sought God's guidance, but conviction revealed a deeper truth. Awareness without action had become his refuge. He knew what was right, he simply delayed doing it. And delay, he was beginning to understand, was its own form of resistance. The discomfort intensified when conviction began to challenge not just his behavior, but his identity. He had built a careful image of himself, faithful, patient, committed. Conviction did not destroy that image, but it questioned its completeness. "You say you trust me," the quiet inner voice seemed to say, "but only when outcomes feel safe. You say you are willing to obey," it continued, "but only when obedience aligns with your preferences." These were not accusations, they were observations, and they were painfully accurate. He noticed how often he spiritualized avoidance, how easily he labeled fear as wisdom, how quickly he excused disobedience with timing. He told himself he was waiting for clarity, when in truth, he was waiting for comfort. Conviction stripped away those justifications. It revealed the cost of his delay, not just to his progress, but to his intimacy with God. Every postponed act of obedience had created distance, not distance imposed by God, but distance chosen by him. This realization stirred something defensive within him. He pushed back mentally, listing the reasons his hesitation made sense. He reminded himself of responsibilities, expectations, risks. Obedience, he argued internally, was not always simple. God understood complexity. God valued wisdom, but conviction remained unmoved. Wisdom, it seemed to whisper, does not contradict obedience. The tension grew as conviction followed him into Scripture. Passages he once read with comfort now confronted him. Words about surrender, trust, and obedience felt sharper, more demanding. He found himself skimming sections that felt too personal, lingering instead on promises that required nothing of him. He noticed this pattern and felt exposed by it. Conviction does not allow selective hearing. The more he resisted, the heavier the discomfort became, not because God increased pressure, but because awareness amplified what had always been present. Ignored conviction does not fade, it intensifies. One evening, overwhelmed by the internal tension, he considered doing what he had done before, distracting himself, filling the silence with noise, activity, anything to quiet the inner unrest. But distraction no longer worked. Conviction had taken root. He realized then that conviction was not asking him to feel bad. It was asking him to change, and change demanded humility. It demanded admitting that his way, though comfortable, had reached its limit. This was the moment where many turned back. He felt the pull of familiarity urging him to retreat, to return to old patterns, to quiet conviction with logic and time, to convince himself that the discomfort would pass if ignored long enough. But something had shifted. He could no longer unsee what had been revealed. Conviction had named the pattern. It had exposed the resistance. And now it waited, not for emotion, but for decision. He remembered how often he had prayed for growth without realizing growth required discomfort. How frequently he asked God to lead him forward while refusing to release what anchored him to the past. Conviction, he realized, was not the enemy of peace. Avoidance was. As this truth settled, fear surfaced, not fear of God, but fear of loss. What would obedience cost him? What would change if he said yes? What would he have to let go of? Control, image, certainty. These questions did not yet have answers, and perhaps they did not need to, because conviction was not asking him to understand everything. It was asking him to trust. That night, he prayed differently, not for escape, not for relief, but for courage. God, he said quietly, I see it now. I just don't know if I'm ready. The honesty felt raw, unfinished. But it was real. Conviction did not respond with condemnation. It remained steady, patient, unwavering. It did not rush him, but it did not retreat either. It simply waited, confident that awareness, once awakened, would eventually demand alignment. As this chapter closes, the protagonist stands in a space more uncomfortable than confusion, but more hopeful than denial. Conviction has done its work. It has revealed the truth. What remains is choice. And the longer conviction is resisted, the heavier it becomes. Soon, he will learn that ignoring conviction does not make it disappear. It transforms it into stagnation. And stagnation, left unchecked, leads to a season that refuses to change. The whisper did not stop. That was the most unsettling part. The protagonist had expected it to fade, to soften, to retreat into the background as time passed. That was how these moments usually went. Conviction flared, stirred discomfort, and then gradually dissolved as life reclaimed its usual pace. He had learned to wait it out, trusting that eventually things would return to normal. But this time, normal did not return. Instead, the whisper followed him with quiet persistence. It did not interrupt his thoughts aggressively or demand immediate action. It simply remained, present, consistent, impossible to forget once noticed. God's voice, he realized, was not loud. It never had been. It came in moments of pause, in the spaces between decisions, in the subtle hesitation before familiar choices. It was not forceful enough to override his will, but it was clear enough to guide it, if he allowed it to. And that was the problem. Allowing it meant yielding control. He began to recognize how intentional his ignoring had become. It was no longer accidental or unconscious. He heard the whisper clearly now. He simply chose not to respond, not because he doubted its source, but because he feared its direction. The whisper asked for small things at first, a different response in a conversation, an apology he had delayed, a boundary he had avoided setting, a step of obedience that felt unnecessary, or at least inconvenient. Small things, yes, but small things that disrupted patterns he had carefully maintained, so he postponed them. "I'll do it later," he told himself, "when the timing is better, when I feel more peace about it." But peace did not come. Instead, the whisper returned, unchanged, patient, unrelenting. Ignoring God's whisper did not bring relief, it brought dullness. His prayers grew flatter, his worship more mechanical. He still believed, still showed up, still spoke the language of faith, but something vital had thinned. He noticed it most during prayer. Where once he felt closeness, now there was distance. Where once words flowed freely, now they felt restrained, filtered, not because God had withdrawn, but because he had learned to speak around obedience rather than toward it. He prayed about everything except the one thing God was addressing, and God, in his gentleness, refused to bypass it. The protagonist began to feel spiritually tired in a way rest could not fix. Sleep did not restore him. Distraction did not refresh him. Even moments of joy felt incomplete, as if something essential had been set aside. He wondered when faith had begun to feel heavy. The answer unsettled him when obedience became optional. Ignoring the whisper did not happen all at once. It was built through small compromises, moments when he chose comfort over conviction, familiarity over faith. Each decision seemed insignificant on its own, but together they formed a pattern of delay. And delay had consequences. He became increasingly sensitive to frustration. Minor inconveniences irritated him. Conversations felt draining. He found himself reacting rather than responding, guarded rather than open. The whisper continued, now quieter, not because God had softened his voice, but because resistance had hardened the listener. He remembered reading that God's voice was like a still, small sound, not competing with noise, but requiring attention. And he wondered how many times he had turned up the noise simply to avoid listening. Busyness became his refuge. He filled his days with tasks, responsibilities, obligations, many of them good, even noble, but they served another purpose as well. They kept him from sitting still long enough to hear what he already knew. Stillness had become dangerous. In stillness, the whisper returned with clarity, so he avoided it. Yet avoidance did not remove the consequences. The same issues persisted. The same emotional walls remained. The same sense of being stalled deepened. Ignoring the whisper did not preserve comfort, it prolonged discomfort. He began to see that God was not asking for dramatic change. He was asking for faithful attention, for responsiveness, for alignment, and alignment required trust. Trust that obedience would not lead to loss. Trust that God's whisper was not meant to harm, but to heal. Trust that God's whisper was not meant to harm, but to heal. Trust that what God asked him to release was already limiting him. Still, fear resisted trust. Fear of being wrong. Fear of losing control. Fear of stepping into uncertainty without guarantees. He realized how much he wanted God to explain everything before he obeyed, to reveal outcomes before he surrendered, to provide assurance before he acted. But faith, he was learning, did not work that way. Faith listened first. One evening, exhausted by internal tension, he acknowledged the truth he had been avoiding. He was not confused about what God wanted. He was conflicted about whether he wanted to do it. That admission stripped away his excuses. Ignoring the whisper was no longer ignorance, it was choice, and choice carried weight. The more he ignored it, the heavier everything felt, not because God added pressure, but because misalignment created friction. Life felt harder because he was moving against the grain of what God was shaping. He thought of how gently God had approached him, No ultimatums, no threats, just invitation, and how consistently he had declined. This realization brought a wave of sorrow, not guilt but grief. Grief for lost time, for delayed growth, for unnecessary struggle. He wondered how different things might have been if he had responded sooner, but regret did not dominate him. Instead, clarity did. Ignoring the whisper had not protected him. It had trapped him in a season that refused to end. A season sustained not by opposition, but by hesitation. As this chapter draws to a close, the protagonist stands at a quiet crossroads. The whisper has not left. It waits, patient as ever. He can continue to ignore it, preserving control while forfeiting progress, or he can listen and step into discomfort that leads to change. He does not yet move, but he understands now that silence is no longer the issue. The real question is whether he will respond before the cost of ignoring becomes too great. The season lingered longer than he ever imagined it would. At first, he had assumed it was temporary, just another difficult stretch that would eventually give way to something lighter. Seasons always changed. That was how life worked. Winter gave way to spring, waiting gave way to movement, silence gave way to clarity. Except this time, it did not. Days turned into weeks, and weeks quietly folded into months. Nothing dramatic happened. There was no collapse, no visible failure, no sudden loss to mark the passage of time. Life continued at a steady pace, but progress did not accompany it. The season stayed. The protagonist began to feel it in subtle ways. Motivation faded, hope dulled. The future, once filled with expectation, now felt distant and undefined. He was not hopeless, but he was tired of hoping without movement. He prayed, of course. He had never stopped praying. But his prayers now carried a different tone, less urgency, more resignation. He asked God to intervene, but without the same confidence he once had. Somewhere along the way, expectation had been replaced with endurance. "I guess this is just how things are right now," he told himself. That sentence frightened him more than any unanswered prayer, because acceptance, when misplaced, becomes surrender to stagnation. He noticed how the season began shaping his thinking. He lowered his expectations, adjusted his dreams, redefined faith as survival rather than growth. He told himself he was being mature, realistic, even wise, but deep down he knew something was wrong. The season was not hostile, it was stagnant, and stagnation, unlike suffering, often goes unrecognized because it feels manageable. There was no crisis forcing him to change, no urgency pushing him forward, just enough comfort to remain, and just enough discomfort to feel restless. It was a dangerous balance. He began to feel as though he was living on pause, present but not advancing, active but not progressing, like a runner on a treadmill, expending energy without moving an inch. The whisper still came, but now it felt distant, not because God had moved away, but because time had layered resistance into habit. Ignoring the whisper had become routine, and routines shape seasons. One morning, as he sat reflecting on how long things had remained unchanged, a thought pierced through his rationalizations with unexpected clarity. This season is not happening to you. This season is waiting on you. The idea startled him. He had always viewed seasons as external, things God imposed or allowed according to his timing. But this thought reframed everything. What if the season remained because it served a purpose not yet fulfilled? What if the delay was not denial, but instruction? He resisted the thought immediately. It felt heavy, almost accusatory. Surely God would not withhold progress simply because of one unresolved issue. Surely growth did not hinge on such a narrow condition. But the evidence around him told a different story. He thought back over the months, the moments of conviction, the repeated patterns, the whisper he had chosen to ignore. Each had pointed to the same underlying lesson, one he had acknowledged but not embraced. And the season had remained unchanged throughout it all. He realized then that God had not frozen him in place. God had simply refused to move him forward while the foundation remained unstable. Progress without alignment would have done more harm than good. This realization brought both clarity and discomfort. Clarity because the season finally made sense. Discomfort because the responsibility rested with him. The season was not punishment, it was mercy. Mercy that protected him from advancing with unresolved pride. Mercy that prevented promotion without preparation. Mercy that refused to let him carry unlearned lessons into new territory. Still, mercy did not feel kind in the moment. He wrestled internally, torn between relief and frustration. Relief that God had not abandoned him. Frustration that growth required more than patience. It required change. He examined his life more honestly now. He saw how the season had exposed his tendencies, how easily he settled when challenged, how quickly he adjusted to limitation, how readily he accepted less than what God had promised. He had confused waiting with obedience. But waiting without listening is not faith. It is delay. The season had become a mirror, reflecting back the areas he avoided. Every day that passed without change was an invitation to respond differently. And every day he delayed was a decision to remain. He began to see that seasons do not change because time passes. They change because lessons are learned, and learning requires participation. This truth weighed heavily on him. He wondered how many others lived this way, faithful but stuck, patient but stagnant, devoted but resistant. How many prayers were sincere yet misdirected, asking God to move while refusing to follow? He did not feel condemned by this realization. He felt awakened. The season had stripped away illusion. It revealed that spiritual maturity was not measured by how long one endured difficulty, but by how willingly one responded to instruction. As days passed, the weight of stagnation grew harder to ignore. The cost of remaining became clearer than the cost of changing. What once felt safer now felt suffocating. And still, fear lingered. Change required surrender. It required stepping into uncertainty without guarantees. It required trusting that obedience would lead somewhere, even if he could not yet see where. He stood at the edge of that decision for longer than he cared to admit, but something within him began to shift. The season, unchanging as it was, had accomplished something essential. It had removed every excuse. He could no longer blame timing, circumstances, or clarity. The lesson had been made plain. What remained was choice. As this chapter closes, the protagonist understands a truth he can no longer escape. God is not withholding the next season. God is waiting for alignment in this one. And alignment, he now knows, cannot be postponed forever, because seasons that do not change eventually demand a breaking point. The breaking point did not arrive with a crash. There was no dramatic collapse, no single moment that announced itself as the end of endurance. Instead, it came quietly, through accumulation. 1,000 small weights pressing on a soul already tired of carrying what it was never meant to hold. The protagonist felt it one ordinary morning, in a moment so unremarkable it almost escaped notice. He woke up as he always did, followed the same routine, prepared for the same kind of day. Nothing was wrong. And yet, everything felt unbearable. The season had finally reached him, not in chaos, but in weariness. He realized he was tired of managing himself, tired of holding back, of staying guarded, of pretending that patience alone was obedience. The effort of remaining unchanged had become heavier than the fear of change. That frightened him, because it meant something had to give. Throughout the day, small frustrations struck harder than they should have. A minor inconvenience felt like an insult. A casual comment felt like a burden. His emotional reserves, once carefully rationed, were gone. By evening, he found himself alone, sitting in silence once again. But this time, the silence felt different. It was not patient. It was pressing. The questions he had avoided now demanded attention. The lesson he had delayed now stood fully formed, undeniable. He could no longer tell himself that he needed more time, more clarity, more confirmation. He had all of it. What he lacked was surrender. The realization broke something open in him. He bowed his head, not out of ritual, but out of exhaustion. And for the first time in a long while, he stopped trying to manage the moment with words. "I can't keep doing this," he admitted quietly. There was no accusation in his voice, no bitterness, just truth. "I've prayed, I've waited, I've tried to endure. But I can't carry this season anymore." The words surprised him, not because they were dramatic, but because they were honest. He was not asking God to change circumstances now. He was acknowledging his limits, and that, he realized, was the breaking point. Not despair, surrender. Tears came, not in a rush, but slowly, as if his soul had been holding them back for months. They were not tears of fear, but of release. He felt something loosen inside him, something rigid he had mistaken for strength. He finally allowed himself to admit what he had resisted all along. He was afraid of losing control, afraid of being misunderstood, afraid of obeying God and discovering that obedience would cost him more than he was willing to give. He had trusted God with outcomes, just not with process. And now, standing at the end of his endurance, he saw how much energy fear had consumed. The breaking point stripped away his defenses. He could no longer negotiate with God or bargain for partial obedience. The season had lasted too long. The weight had grown too heavy. "Tell me what you want," he whispered. "Not what I want to hear, what you want." The room felt still, but the stillness was not empty. The whisper returned, not louder, not harsher, but unmistakably clear. It did not introduce anything new. It simply repeated what had been there all along, the lesson, the one he had avoided because it threatened his comfort, the one he had postponed because it demanded trust, the one he had recognized but never embraced. Now, in his breaking, it felt different. It felt necessary. He saw how every delay had led here, how every ignored conviction had added weight to the season, how every attempt to escape had deepened the exhaustion. The breaking point revealed the truth he could no longer deny. God had not been trying to break him. God had been trying to free him. Freedom, however, required letting go. He sat there for a long time, wrestling, not with God, but with himself. Old arguments resurfaced, but they felt weaker now. Fear still spoke, but its voice no longer carried authority. The cost of obedience was still real, but so was the cost of refusal. And for the first time, refusal felt more dangerous than faith. He thought of how much time he had spent asking God to remove the pressure, never realizing that pressure was exposing what needed to change. He had mistaken discomfort for opposition, when it was actually invitation. The breaking point did not demand immediate action. It demanded decision, and decision demanded honesty. "I don't know how this will turn out," he said quietly, "but I don't want to stay here anymore." That sentence marked the shift. He was no longer asking God to act so he could respond. He was offering to respond so God could act. The difference was subtle, but everything changed with it. As the weight lifted slightly, not entirely but enough to breathe, he felt something unfamiliar settle in its place. Peace, not the peace of resolution, but the peace of alignment, the kind that arrives not when problems disappear, but when resistance ends. He realized that breaking was not the end of faith, it was the beginning of obedience. The season had done its work. It had led him to the place where illusion could no longer survive, where pretending was no longer possible, where honesty became unavoidable. He was still afraid. But now, fear no longer dictated his choices. As the night deepened, he remained seated, aware that something irreversible had occurred within him. He had not yet acted. He had not yet changed anything externally. But internally, the decision had been made, and decisions, once made in truth, begin to move things even before action follows. The breaking point did not resolve the lesson. It opened the door to it. As this chapter closes, the protagonist stands on the edge of surrender, not yet transformed, but no longer resisting. The season has brought him to the end of himself. And at the end of himself, he is finally ready to listen. What comes next will not be easy, but it will be clear. Surrender did not arrive as a sudden act of courage. It came quietly, almost imperceptibly, in the space where resistance had finally grown tired of fighting. The protagonist did not feel brave. He did not feel strong. What he felt more than anything was willing, and that willingness changed everything. In the days following his breaking point, life did not immediately look different. Circumstances remained the same. The season did not end overnight. Problems did not dissolve in response to his decision. If anything, the external world seemed unimpressed by what had happened within him, but internally, something profound had shifted. For the first time, he stopped arguing with God. Not aloud, not in prayer, not in thought. The endless internal negotiations, the what-ifs, the conditions, the delays, grew quiet. In their place was a simple, steady openness, a readiness to hear without filtering, to receive without reshaping. He returned to prayer, but the posture was different now. He did not begin with requests. He did not rush to explain himself. Often he said very little at all. "Here I am," he whispered one morning. "Teach me." Those words felt heavier than any prayer he had spoken before, because teaching implied learning, and learning implied change. The revelation did not come as a dramatic insight or sudden vision. It unfolded gradually, like light entering a room that had long been dim. Piece by piece, clarity formed, not about everything, but about what mattered most. He began to see the lesson God had been shaping all along. It was not about the season. It was not about the delay. It was not even about the outcome he so desperately wanted. It was about trust, not the kind of trust that believes God can act, but the kind that allows God to lead. Trust that relinquishes control. Trust that obeys without guarantees. Trust that values alignment over understanding. He saw how often he had confused faith with certainty, how he waited to feel safe before obeying, how he demanded explanations before surrendering, and how that need for certainty had kept him from growth. God was not withholding answers. God was inviting relationship. The revelation deepened as he reflected on his own patterns. He recognized how his fear of loss had shaped his decisions, how protecting himself had become second nature, how obedience felt risky because it threatened the identity he had carefully constructed. God's lesson, he realized, was not asking him to become someone else. It was asking him to become honest. Honest about what he feared, honest about what he avoided, honest about where he trusted himself more than God. This honesty did not shame him, it freed him. For the first time, he understood that surrender was not weakness, it was alignment. It was choosing God's wisdom over his own instincts, God's timing over his urgency, God's shaping over his shortcuts. The more he surrendered internally, the clearer the lesson became. God was teaching him obedience before outcome. He had always believed obedience was a means to an end, a way to unlock blessing, movement, progress. But now he saw it differently. Obedience was the point. It was the place where transformation happened. Everything else flowed from it. This revelation reframed the season entirely. What once felt like delay now felt like preparation. What once felt like resistance now felt like refinement. God had not been silent. He had been precise. The season had lasted exactly as long as it needed to, not because God was slow, but because growth takes time and surrender cannot be rushed. He began to notice changes in himself, small at first, but unmistakable. He listened more carefully. He reacted less defensively. He paused before responding where he once rushed to justify. These were not dramatic changes, but they were real, and they were costly. Each small act of obedience required him to let go of something: pride, control, the need to be right, the comfort of familiarity. Each surrender felt like a loss until he realized it was making space. Space for peace, space for clarity, space for God. One afternoon, while reflecting quietly, he realized something that stopped him cold. God had not asked him to understand the lesson before obeying it. He had only asked him to trust. Understanding, he now saw, often comes after obedience, not before. Revelation follows surrender, not the other way around. This truth settled deeply in him. He no longer felt the need to rush the process. The urgency that once drove his prayers had softened into patience, not passive patience, but active faithfulness. He was learning to walk step by step without demanding to see the entire path. The whisper, once ignored, now guided him gently. Not constantly, not dramatically, but faithfully. It did not overwhelm him with instructions. It led him one choice at a time. And for the first time, he followed. He understood now why the season could not change earlier. Advancement without surrender would have amplified his fear, not healed it. Promotion without obedience would have deepened his insecurity, not strengthened his faith. God had been protecting him from himself. This realization filled him with gratitude, not for the struggle itself, but for the purpose within it. As this chapter draws to a close, the protagonist stands in a new internal landscape. The lesson has been revealed, not as information, but as transformation in progress. He is not finished, but he is aligned. And alignment, he is beginning to understand, is what allows movement to begin. The season is still present, but it no longer defines him. It no longer traps him. It has become a place of learning rather than waiting. What comes next will build on this surrender, because when the heart changes, the path begins to open. Change did not announce itself loudly. There was no moment where the sky opened or circumstances shifted dramatically. No clear signal that the season had officially ended. Instead, change revealed itself through movement. Subtle at first, almost easy to miss. But it was there. The protagonist noticed it in the way his mornings felt lighter, even when nothing external had improved. The weight he had carried for so long no longer pressed as heavily against his chest. Not because the burden had disappeared, but because he was no longer resisting what God was doing within him. Learning had begun to take root, and learning, he discovered, changes everything. He moved through familiar situations with a different posture now. Where he once reacted instinctively, he paused. Where he once defended himself, he listened. Where he once demanded resolution, he practiced patience. These changes did not feel dramatic. They felt intentional. He began to see how obedience altered perspective. The same circumstances that once frustrated him now revealed opportunities for growth. The same delays that once felt oppressive now felt purposeful. The environment had not changed, but his interpretation of it had. And interpretation shapes experience. He realized that learning God's lesson had not removed the challenge. It had removed the struggle against it. He was no longer fighting the season. He was walking through it. This distinction mattered more than he had anticipated. As he aligned his actions with what God had been teaching him, small shifts occurred around him. Conversations took different turns. Doors that once felt stuck began to open, not suddenly, but naturally. Relationships that had been tense grew lighter. Decisions that once felt paralyzing now felt clearer. None of this felt forced. It felt aligned. He understood now that alignment creates momentum. Not because God rewards obedience instantly, but because obedience positions the heart to move when God leads. Learning had recalibrated his expectations. He no longer measured progress by speed or visibility. He measured it by faithfulness, by whether his choices reflected trust rather than fear. This new way of measuring growth brought unexpected peace. He noticed how his prayers had changed again. They were no longer centered on outcomes. They focused on guidance, wisdom, and faithfulness. He asked God how to respond rather than when things would change. And in doing so, he found himself more aware of God's presence, not in dramatic moments, but in daily decisions. Learning had sharpened his sensitivity. He began to recognize how much energy he had once spent resisting God's instruction, how exhausting it had been to maintain control, how heavy it felt to carry responsibility for outcomes that were never his to manage. Now that burden had lifted. Trust did not eliminate responsibility, but it clarified it. His responsibility was obedience. God's responsibility was direction. This understanding freed him to move forward without fear of making every decision perfectly. He no longer felt paralyzed by the need to get everything right. He focused on getting the next step right, one step at a time. He also recognized something else. Learning God's lesson had not only changed him, it had changed how he related to others. He was more patient, more present, more willing to extend grace. Not because he tried harder, but because humility had softened him. The lesson had reshaped his posture toward life. He realized that transformation often looks unimpressive from the outside, but internally it rearranges everything. It reorders priorities. It redefines success. It shifts what matters most. Learning had done that for him. He was still walking through uncertainty, still navigating unanswered questions, still trusting God without full clarity. But now, uncertainty did not threaten him. It invited dependence. He thought back to the season that once felt endless, the stagnation that had frustrated him, the silence that had confused him. None of it had been wasted. Every moment had led here to learning, and learning had unlocked movement. Not because God had been waiting to bless him, but because God had been waiting for him to listen. The realization humbled him deeply. He saw now how often believers confuse delay with denial, silence with absence, and repetition with opposition. In truth, God often uses all three as teachers, and when the lesson is learned, movement follows. Not always immediately, not always dramatically, but inevitably. He felt a quiet confidence rising within him, not confidence in himself, but in God's faithfulness. He trusted that whatever came next would be shaped by obedience, not urgency. This trust allowed him to step forward without fear. As this chapter draws to a close, the protagonist recognizes that learning God's lesson has altered the trajectory of his life, not by changing everything at once, but by changing him. And that change has made all the difference. What once held him back now prepares him to move forward. The season has done its work. And now something new is beginning. This story does not end with him. It turns toward you, because somewhere along this journey, between silence and surrender, repetition and revelation, you likely recognized yourself. Not in every detail, perhaps, but in the tension, in the waiting, in the quiet sense that something has been asking for your attention longer than you care to admit. So now, the question is no longer about the protagonist. It is about you. What is repeating in your life right now? Not the obvious struggles, the deeper ones, the patterns that return no matter how much you pray for change, the same emotional walls, the same conflicts, the same inner resistance that surfaces in different forms. What keeps coming back? And more importantly, what have you been asking God to remove when He may be trying to teach you instead? It is easier to pray for escape than for transformation, easier to ask God to change circumstances than to change us, easier to wait for a breakthrough than to respond to a lesson. But God's love does not rush growth. He is patient enough to repeat himself. If a season in your life feels stalled, it may not be because God has forgotten you. It may be because he is focused on you, shaping something essential before allowing you to move forward. Ask yourself honestly, what conviction have you felt but postponed? What whisper have you heard but ignored? What obedience have you delayed, waiting for comfort or certainty? God rarely shouts. He teaches through patterns, through repetition, through moments that feel familiar because they are intentional. And the lesson you avoid today often becomes the season you repeat tomorrow. This is not meant to condemn you, it is meant to awaken you, because the same God who patiently teaches is also eager to lead you forward. He does not withhold the next chapter out of punishment, but out of preparation. God cares too much to rush what must be formed. And here is the hope. The moment you choose to learn, things begin to move. Not always instantly, not always visibly, but internally first. And internally is where every lasting change begins. You do not need perfect understanding to respond. You only need willingness. God is not asking you to fix your life. He's asking you to trust him with it. What you release in obedience, he replaces with peace. What you surrender in humility, he transforms into strength. What you learn in this season becomes the foundation for the next. So if you feel stuck, do not ask only, God, when will this change? Ask also, God, what are you teaching me here? Because when the lesson is learned, the season shifts. And when the heart aligns, the path opens. Now, here is your invitation. If this message spoke to you, do not ignore that stirring. Take a moment and reflect. What is God teaching you right now? Write it down. Pray about it. Be honest with him. If this message helped you, like this video so more people can hear it. Subscribe to this channel for more biblical reflections that speak to real life. Share this video with someone who may be stuck in a season they don't understand. And if you feel led, leave a comment below saying, I choose to listen. Because sometimes, the first act of obedience is simply responding. This story ends here, but your next season can begin today, when you decide to listen to what God is teaching you now.